So, welcome, those of you who braved the morning with us. Welcome to our final day of what has been an extremely informative and engaging OMEP World Conference. Throughout this World Assembly and Conference, we've heard so many things, both sobering and heartening accounts of early care and education in the global landscape. Dr. Schaefer's presentation on the polycrises affecting children dovetails nicely into this final presentation, so thank you for all of your detail that you provided. The trouble with being the last keynote speaker and number 10 on the list is that you have to come up with something slightly new and different to talk about. After we've listened to all of these wonderful presentations over the last few days. So this morning we're going to do something just a little bit different. And again, Dr. Schaefer's presentation was great in starting with the reflective questions that need to be asked. So we'll do some more of that. So I invite you, in the short time period we have for the remainder of this keynote, to think a little differently this morning. To take the opportunity to think about reflective activities that you can do and continue beyond this conference. So I'll present a series of questions that are designed to foster a deeper personal connection to the topics discussed, and I encourage you to consider how you can apply these principles in your own lives and communities. So, in 1987, the Brundtland Commission, convened by the United Nations, created one of the most universal and enduring definitions of sustainable development, which is still used today, and that is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. With all of the uncertainty that we have, it's hard to decide where that line is. But I recently come across a new definition that I think is a little more of a modern interpretation, even though the original remains extremely relevant. And this one really resonates with me from an early care and education perspective, and that's, we don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. Both of these definitions invoke a heavy sense of responsibility as to how we will accomplish the monumental task ahead of us that, as previously noted, are still somewhat unknown. So, I changed the title of this presentation just a little bit to Shaping Sustainable Futures: Pathways to Educational, Social, and Environmental Resilience. And what I'd really like for you to do is think about how to personalize these different aspects. So the reality is that international and national frameworks, goals, declarations, all of these things are important. As we've heard repeatedly over the last few days, we've been exposed to the Tashkent Declaration, reminded of the Sustainable Development Goals. All of these things have their place. However, most of us will not be at the policy drafting tables where these initiatives are developed. Although this is the case, your input is still critical in other ways, as the work being done at local, community, and individual levels is equally important. And in that sense, we as an OMEP collective are all stewards of a sustainable future. So yesterday, Betsabi highlighted the importance of a multi-sectorial approach that engages both education and health. I would encourage you to expand on that idea and view a multi-sectorial approach as not only a linear engagement across interconnected sectors, but also along spheres of influence, from the global and national to the local implementation. So, to effectively move forward from large-scale data and policy frameworks to localized action and implementation, I'd like us to consider 4 recommended social constructs that I think are important to further this narrative. These include the following: strengths-based approaches that embrace the multiple realities that coexist in communities and help to support holistic narratives. Equitable practices that are inclusive and are not performative in nature or focused on tokenized engagement of marginalized groups. Historical empathy that not only acknowledges the unfortunate impacts of imperialism, but also highlights the fundamental value of global majority perspectives. And lastly, tangible realities that create protective factors and serve as buffers against adverse effects of risk factors, fostering resilience and enabling individuals to thrive even in challenging circumstances. So, what does that actually mean? So the first social construct is that we need to implement strength-based approaches. A strength-based approach acknowledges and builds upon positive attributes and potential of communities. By encouraging individuals to share their knowledge and lived experiences, we can identify and leverage the inherent strengths, talents, and resources of communities, rather than concentrating on their deficiencies or problems. This method fosters a sense of empowerment and ownership among participants, leading to sustainable and meaningful outcomes. So, here's our reflective question to ask ourselves. How do we identify and leverage, within our unique community settings, the strengths and experiences that contribute to holistic change in those said communities? So, essentially, how do we value the local expertise that you already have? And how do we use that to build better sustainable narratives? And then the second is, how do we counteract this preference for deficit-based analysis that we often find in a development context? So that deficit-based approach is finding all of the challenges and collecting information and highlighting them, but not focusing on the lens of the positives that those environments have. So I would encourage you to think about how you can adapt these perspectives into your own setting. So the second social construct is about equitable practices. We cannot abide by unequal realities in creating sustainable development initiatives. Disparities and inequalities exist, which must be counteracted by the fair and equitable distribution of resources, opportunities, and benefits. Allowing these significant inequalities to persist undermines the foundations of sustainability, creating social unrest and economic instability. Inequalities can lead to further disenfranchised communities that are less likely to engage in sustainable practices or have the resources to do so. So what does this mean for us in this context? So the reflective question here is, how do we determine the lens through which we view qualified sustainable development practices? So essentially, are we all speaking the same language? Are we all reading from the same hymn book, so to speak? And second to that, are diverse groups adequately represented in the planning and decision-making processes in localized communities? So In this context, I would encourage you to think about how you can recognize the power dynamics that exist within your spaces. The individuals who are most impacted or who have the resources and the knowledge are not always necessarily the individuals who are the decision makers. So how do we create environments where there's a little bit more of a leveling of the playing field and how policies and practices are implemented? The third construct centers on embracing historical empathy and disavowing colonial mindsets. This requires an inclusive approach to understanding history, one that actively seeks out and values the narrative of all groups, especially those who have been marginalized or oppressed. Traditional historical narratives often emphasize the viewpoints and experiences of dominant cultures, typically those of colonizers, while often overlooking or minimizing the experiences of indigenous peoples and other marginalized groups. So in this context, what impact have dominant cultures and historical paradigms had on policy formations within the communities that you exist in? How do we further the narrative that the expertise often needed when we think about sustainability and policies and programs is often already present in those localized communities? We just have to access it. So the fourth construct is around building tangible realities. This suggests that an active process of creation, construction, and development requires intentional effort and work towards achieving outcomes. It also means focusing on implementing solutions that can be seen, touched, and experienced, ensuring that efforts result in actual improvements and benefits. This also emphasizes the importance of creating practical, real-world solutions and outcomes that have measurable and concrete impact. So again, as we reflect on this, what specific actions can be taken within your communities to ensure that the ideas and efforts present result in measurable incomes that positively impact communities? So essentially, moving from theoretical conversations and data frameworks to actual practice and implementation. Oh, that was not the right slide. So, by integrating these practices, local and community initiatives can effectively contribute to achieving sustainability, particularly related to quality education and good health and well-being. I think I would be remiss if I didn't also note that we live in a very globalized world. Today we're gathered here together in Bangkok, but in the coming days we will scatter all over the world back to our real lives and experiences. But it's important to note that there's a set of interconnected threads that link us together, and that these often shift as we meet new people, as we're exposed to new experiences, as we find commonalities in the work that we're doing. As part of that, what's happening in the larger ecosystem also has to be relevant. So in thinking about things like migration, whether it's forced or voluntary, it's a reality of our times. So is war, famine, child abuse, and sometimes there's only one degree of separation between us and these issues, and sometimes not even that. So today a child could be in the Zatari refugee camp in Jordan, and next week in a neighborhood in the US. How are we prepared to meet the needs of that child and their family based on the constructs and policies that we've created within our localized communities? We can't work towards global development goals without this sustained understanding that there are overlapping realities that exist for all of us. And finally, in that spirit, I'll leave you with this quote from Paul Wellstone. When we all do better, we all do better. Thank you.